Seraphim Rose, Reception and Corrective Baptism, published by Uncut Mountain Press, with love and devotion to Higher Monk, Seraphim Rose. Free ebook available at uncutmountainpress.com. Introduction. The reception of the heterodox, non-Orthodox Christians into the Orthodox Church remains a hotly debated topic, particularly in America and in other lands where overlapping Orthodox jurisdictions may have differing practices influenced by the historical circumstances of their respective countries of origin. If the reception of the heterodox into the Orthodox Church is a contentious topic, even more so is the topic of corrective baptism. Corrective baptism refers to the practice of baptizing a person in the Orthodox Church who has previously received into the Orthodox Church by a method other than baptism without the canonical presuppositions for the application of economy. These topics were debated just as much during the life of Father Seraphim Rose of Platina as they are today, so it should be of little surprise that there continues to be great interest in his views on these topics. While he hasn't been officially glorified, Father Seraphim is widely venerated as a saint by Orthodox Christians in America, and perhaps even more so in traditional Orthodox countries. Father Seraphim is also widely considered to be the first American-born convert to Orthodoxy to be venerated as a saint, and in his writings he is well known for advocating the royal path of the Fathers on various topics while avoiding extremes on both sides. Father Seraphim is well known for his extensive patristic commentary on the book of Genesis and Genesis creation and early man, and on the topic of the departure of the soul and the soul after death. On the topic of baptism and the reception of converts, however, Father Seraphim did not publish anything of his own on the topic, neither books nor articles for his periodical, The Orthodox Word. It is clear from his published writings and over 300 of his personal letters that have been made available that he did not study the topic extensively, nor did he claim to receive any divine revelation on the matter. When quotes from Father Seraphim on this topic have been shared in various articles, these quotes are typically derived from one or two of his personal letters, but are presented without clearly explaining the context of his words. The purpose of this booklet is to review Father Seraphim's views on the reception of converts and corrective baptism more comprehensively from the articles he personally published in the Orthodox Word, statements he made in published writings, and the more than 300 personal letters from Father Seraphim that have been made public. To better understand Father Seraphim's views on the topic, it is first important to understand the circumstances of his own reception into the Church and the ecclesiastical situation in row court at the time of his writing. Father Seraphim's reception into the Orthodox Church. Eugene Rose, the future Father Seraphim, was baptized and confirmed by Protestant Methodists when he was in the 8th grade. When Eugene converted to Orthodoxy in 1962, Father Nicholas Dombrowski received him by chrismation at the Joy of All Who Sorrow Cathedral, following the instructions of Archbishop Tikhon of San Francisco and Western America of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. His reception by chrismation rather than by baptism at this time is not surprising. Prior to the Moscow Council of 1666 to 1667, converts to Orthodoxy in Russia were received by baptism. Due to the unfortunate heterodox influences in Russia in the 17th century, quote, the rite for the reception of Latins into the Orthodox Church was now completely changed, unquote, and the reception of the heterodox by baptism ceased to be the standard practice in Russia. The priest service books were modified accordingly, and private publishing houses were forbidden in order to prevent the publication of teachings contrary to the official positions of the Holy Synod. Many holy people in Russia after the 17th century took for granted that their service books were correct, since they were endorsed by the Holy Synod, and simply followed the practice of receiving the heterodox by chrismation, or even by confession of faith. If they had been baptized by the heterodox in water in the name of the Holy Trinity, it wasn't until 1971, 9 years after Father Seraphim's reception, that the Synod of Rocourt evaluated the history and canons relevant to the reception of converts and recognized that the traditional practice of the Church was to receive all converts by baptism. It was then that ROCOR issued a decree to the effect that all converts should be received by baptism unless economy was warranted out of necessity. Considering the practice of Russia after the 1667 Council and Eugene's own reception by chrismation, it should be of no surprise that Eugene would say in a letter on May 5th, 1970, to Craig, the future Father Alexei Young, and his wife Susan regarding the reception of their son into the Church, that, quote, "If, as I presume, he has been baptized, you should supply his baptismal certificate too. He will be received by chrismation," unquote. This was 1 year prior to the ROCOR's decree on the reception of converts. At that time, Eugene was only a tonsured reader. He had not yet been tonsured into monasticism, and he was simply informing his family of the common practice in ROCOR at the time. Publications of Father Seraphim on the reception of converts. Eugene Rose and his friend Gleb Podmoshensky, the future Father Herman, published the first edition of their periodical, The Orthodox Word, in 1965 with the blessing of St. John Maximovich, who was at that time the Archbishop of Western America in San Francisco. In 1965, on the Feast of the Annunciation, Eugene was ordained a reader by St. John, who reposed over a year later on June 19th, July 2nd, 1966. In 1967, Eugene and his friend Gleb acquired the land for the future St. Herman's Monastery in Platina, California, where they then moved on the eve of the Dormition Feast. August 15th, 28th, 1969, Eugene and Gleb were tonsured into monasticism on October 14th, 27th, 1970 by Archimandrite Spiridon, a spiritual child of St. John, and Bishop Nictari on December 20th, 1976, June 2nd, 1977. Father Seraphim was ordained to the diaconate, and on April 11th, 24th, 1977, he was ordained to the priesthood by Bishop Nictari of ROCOR. According to the offer of his life, Hieromonk Damascene Christensen, after Father Seraphim's ordination to the priesthood, quote, he baptized all the people whom he received into the Church, including those formerly baptized into non-Orthodox confessions, unquote. When reading various statements from Father Seraphim and published writings and correspondence, it is helpful to understand his words in the context of his development from a new convert through his tonsure to monasticism and his ordination to the priesthood. While Father Seraphim did not author any books or articles on the subject of the reception of converts and corrective baptism, he did publish articles and books by and about the saints and on current events in church life that are relevant to the topic. Two of the most important saints of this 18th and 19th centuries that upheld the teaching that all converts should be received into the Orthodox Church by baptism were St. Paisius Velichovsky and St. Nicodemus Zaharay. In 1976, St. Herman's Brotherhood published the book Blessed Paisius Velichovsky, the man behind the Philokalia. Father Seraphim wrote the following in an introduction to his most important work. Quote, for Orthodox Christians of the 20th century, there is no more important Holy Father of recent times than Blessed Paisius Velichovsky. This is so not merely because of his holy life, not merely because, like another St. Gregory Palamas, he defended the hesychast practice of the mental prayer Jesus, not only because he, through his many disciples, inspired the great monastic revival of the 19th century, which flowered most notably in the holy elders of Platina Monastery, but most of all because he redirected the attention of Orthodox Christians to the sources of holy orthodoxy, which are the only foundation of true Orthodox life and thought, whether of the past or of the present, whether of monks or of laymen. Unquote. On the influence of St. Paisius on the patristic and hesychastic revival in this 19th century Russia, Father Seraphim continued, quote, having come to spiritual maturity, Blessed Paisius then himself became a source and seedbed for the great monastic and patristic revival of Holy Russia in the 19th century. True patristic spirituality and its hesychast tradition, to be sure, never died out in Russia, not even in the 18th century, that age of pseudo-enlightenment, when the Empress Catherine closed most of the Orthodox monasteries and strictly regulated the rest of them. No, it remained and provided the fertile ground on which the disciples and the example of Blessed Paisius were to bear such great spiritual fruits. But it required the patristic bees of the great Elder Paisius, bringing back the pollen of the true and free tradition of orthodoxy under the much more favorable climate of the 19th century, to cause the native Russian trees to give forth such a marvelous abundance of spiritual fruit." Unquote. Regarding the version of the life of St. Paisius that St. Herman's Monastery published, Father Seraphim said, quote, "The life of Elder Paisius, which we here present as written by his own disciples, chiefly by Schema monk Metrophanes of Niemetz Monastery, and was published in its present form exactly 125 years ago, 1847, by the God-bearing elders of Platina Monastery, as the first of the texts of the veritable patristic revival which they inspired in the 19th century Russia." Unquote. Father Seraphim's regard for St. Paisius Filichovsky, in recognition of his central role in the patristic and hesychastic revival that occurred in 19th century Russia, largely due to Platina Monastery's publication of this life, are notable in that this life clearly states that St. Paisius, quote, "was so apprehensive about heresies and schisms that all who were converted, whether from sects or from the Western Latin heresies, be baptized." Unquote. Neither Father Seraphim nor the Platina elders appear to have expressed disagreement with St. Paisius' position that all converts to orthodoxy should be received by baptism, despite the fact that the Church in Russia had, prior to St. Paisius, adopted a contrary teaching at the Moscow Council of 1666 through 1667. St. Paisius Filichovsky was the spiritual father of Father Dorotheos Bolismas, who was appointed by the Patriarch of Constantinople to review the rudder of St. Nicodemus, which contains the canons of the Church, and the commentary of St. Nicodemus, which include all of the canons relevant to the reception of converts into the Church. St. Paisios responded with Bolismas and the Colivades fathers regarding the reception of converts into the Church, and they all agreed that converts should be received into the Orthodox Church by baptism and 3 full immersions. At the request of St. Paisius, Bolismas prepared a defense of the reception of Latins and Uniates by baptism, which was then translated into Romanian and published. St. Paisius was originally from Russia, but fled to Mount Athos in 1746 to become a monk after a spiritually unfruitful education at the Kiev Academy. St. Paisius remained on Mount Athos until 1763, after which St. Nicodemus the Hagorite arrived and continued his work of seeking out and studying the canons and patristic writings while living a life of hesychasm. While St. Nicodemus produced an abundance of writings, he is perhaps best known for his compilation of and commentary on the canons of the Church and the rudder, as St. Paisios inspired the patristic and hesychastic revival among the Slavs. St. Nicodemus did the same for the Greeks. In the rudder, St. Nicodemus explains why, based on the canons, the Latins must be received into the Church by baptism, since they are heretics, and because they did not practice baptism as required by the canons, with 3 immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity. In the September-October 1965 edition of the Orthodox Word, Eugene published an article on St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, written by John Mavros. In this edition, Eugene wrote the following introductory words on the significance of Mount Athos and St. Nicodemus. Quote, "The noble brow of the holy mountain of Athos, where for 1,000 years Orthodox monks in many nations have furnished numerous shining examples of the Orthodox spiritual life and practice, has itself become a standard and symbol of that spiritual life. It has become a symbol, too, of faithfulness to the holy canons and traditions of the Orthodox Church. It was here that St. Nicodemus compiled the metaphorical rudder of the patristic canons that guide the ship of the Church on its stormy course through the world. Our own age is a time of self-will and confusion that have spread from modern free thought into the Church of Christ herself. When even Orthodox hierarchs depart from the straight narrow path of faithfulness to holy orthodoxy, in such a time the spirit of Mount Athos still speaks to Orthodox believers. To be Orthodox, it is not enough to lead a good life, trusting in one's own judgment to determine what such a life is. It is not enough even to call oneself Orthodox, to believe the whole of Christian doctrine, and to profess fidelity to canonical orthodoxy, if these are no more than words which one's actions belie. There are laws of the spiritual life and laws of religious practice as well as of doctrine. These are not the goals, but they are indispensable means to the goal of the Christian life. It is those who are faithful in spirit as well as letter, those who truly follow the guidance of the sure rudder, who belong to the true Church of Christ, the Ark of Salvation." Unquote. On the back of his edition of the Orthodox Word is a list of books available for sale, which included a copy of the rudder in English, indicating that Eugene had access to this important text, even in 1965. In the article on St. Nicodemus, printed in the periodical, it was clearly said that St. Nicodemus, quote, believed the Roman Catholic Church to be totally depraved of grace and even of valid baptism. Unquote. In the same edition of the Orthodox Word, Eugene stated regarding St. Nicodemus and St. Paisius in an article on the Philokalia, quote, "With the French Revolution, the flood of atheism set out on its course throughout the world, and subsequently every nation was found to be more or less receptive to it. As against this, the words of St. Nicodemus set forth the true Orthodox Christian spiritual life for those who, in the new age of universal apostasy, wish to be conscientious, mindful Christians. At the same time, another Athonite, Starets Paisi Velichovsky, then in Moldavia, was living this same spiritual life in the tradition of the Holy Fathers and translating the Philokalia into Slavonic. It is the complementary labors of St. Nicodemus and Starets Paisi that have made the riches of Orthodox spirituality available to the God-seekers of modern times." Unquote. In the same 1965 periodical, Eugene published a text, "The True Church of Christ" by St. Sebastian Dabovich of Jackson and San Francisco. In this article, St. Sebastian stated, quote, "For a priesthood to be lawful, the priest must administer the sacraments orderly, according to the rules of the Holy Church Catholic, not changing essential actions, as there are acts and conditions in the rites of the mysteries that are essential, without which a certain sacrament may not be valid. Should a sacred minister violate an essential rule, he is subject to deposition. If the violation has been intentional, or at least the mystery is void of power. The 50th rule of the Apostolic Canon enjoins, should anyone, bishop or presbyter, administer not 3 immersions in baptism in commemoration of the death of the Lord, but 1, let him be cast out. And those who were baptized by 1 immersion, it was ordered that they should be rebaptized." Unquote. Here St. Sebastian clearly agrees with St. Nicodemus and the rudder that those who are not baptized in 3 immersions are not baptized and remain in need of baptism. The fact that the Latins and Protestants ceased baptizing in 3 immersions, as required by the canons, was a major factor that led the patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, and Jerusalem to decree in 1755 that all converts must be received by baptism. This is also a major reason why today corrective baptisms are performed. Since most heterodox who are received into the Church by a method other than baptism never received the apostolic and canonical form of baptism from the heterodox, 3 immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity. in the November-December 1971 edition of the Orthodox Word, Father Seraphim printed the 1971 Decree of the Rocourt Synod of Bishops regarding the reception of converts. This was a historically significant decree because Rocourt by that time had received many Greeks and was challenged by them to clarify the Church's historic teaching on the reception of converts. The Holy Synod recognized that historically converts from the Latins and Protestants were received by baptism until this practice was changed in Russia in the 17th to early 18th centuries under Peter I. The decree published in the Orthodox Word stated, with regard to Roman Catholics and those Protestants who claim to reserve baptism as a sacrament, for example the Lutherans, in Russia, since the time of Peter I, the practice was introduced of receiving them without baptism, through renunciation of heresy and the chrismation of Protestants and unconfirmed Catholics. Before Peter, Catholics were baptized in Russia. In Greece, the practice was also varied, but almost 300 years ago, after a certain interruption, the practice of baptizing converts from Catholicism and Protestantism was reintroduced. Those received in any other way have sometimes not been recognized in Greece as Orthodox. In many cases, such children of our Russian Church were not even admitted to Holy Communion. Having in view this circumstance and also the current growth of the ecumenist heresy, which attempts completely to erase the difference between orthodoxy and any heresy, so that the Moscow Patriarchate, notwithstanding the Holy Canons, has even issued a decree permitting Roman Catholics to receive communion in certain cases. The sober bishops acknowledge the necessity of introducing a stricter practice, i.e., to baptize all heretics who come to the Church, only in case of necessity, and with permission of the bishop allowing, for reasons of economy or pastoral condescension, or any other practice with regard to certain persons." Unquote. In the January-February 1972 edition of the Orthodox Word, Father Seraphim published an article with the title, "Orthodoxy in the Contemporary World. Archbishop, Priest, Parish Leave Metropola because of Modernism, Renovationism, Heresy." This article was about the departure from the Orthodox Church in America, formerly known as the Metropolia, before 1970, of Archbishop Ambrovi of Pittsburgh and his reception into Rocourt. In the OCA/Metropolia, Archbishop Ambrosi, quote, was for 12 years Bishop of Sitka and Alaska, and for 7 months Bishop of Japan, unquote. In the declaration of Archbishop Ambrosi, February 29th/March 13th, 1972, that was published as part of this article, Archbishop Ambrovi relates how one of his priests received a corrective baptism when joining Rocourt. Quote, "In early January, the former priest of the Metropolia, St. Peter and Paul Church in Manville, New Jersey, Father George Lewis, a young convert who had been received by the Metropolia from the Uniates as a priest without ordination, was baptized, chrismated, and ordained as a priest in the Russian Church outside of Russia in New York City." Unquote. In May of 1981, which is 1 year before his repose, in a talk given at the University of Santa Cruz, which was later published under the title God's Revelation to the Human Heart, Father Seraphim makes it clear that true sacraments are only to be found in the Orthodox Church, and that there is no grace in the sacraments of Roman Catholics and Protestants. Quote, "Of course, Roman Catholics and a few other groups do consider themselves to have sacraments. I myself would say that the true sacraments, in the sense that Christ founded them, are to be found only in the Orthodox Church." Unquote. And quote, "The Church of Christ is that which gives grace to people, and in the West, when Rome broke off from its church, this grace was actually lost." Unquote. End quote. In many cases, Anglicans are trying hard, but they're starting from so far away. When you come to God, you can't just think it out or devise a system. You have to come into living contact with His grace. Therefore, the answer for Anglicanism is to come into contact with the Church." Unquote. These are the texts that Father Seraphim printed in the Orthodox Word, and in the books published by St. Herman's, which touch on the topics of the reception of converts and corrective baptism. It is clear that Father Seraphim had the utmost reverence for St. Paisius Filichovsky and St. Nicodemus the Hagarite, both of whom insisted that all converts be received by baptism, and that the non-Orthodox could not be received by any other means if they had not previously received the apostolic form of baptism, 3 full immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity. Roquefort's decision in 1971 to receive all converts by baptism was also accepted and published by Father Seraphim. As a notable example of corrective baptism, Father Seraphim published the account of Archbishop Ambrose's reception into Roquefort from the Metropolia that included the corrective baptism of Father George Lewis. All of these texts were published by Father Seraphim without any footnotes or explanations that would suggest any disagreement with these writings. In fact, in the many books and editions of the Orthodox Word published by Father Seraphim from 1965 until his repose in 1982, not a single criticism can be found of the practice of receiving all converts by baptism, or of the corrective baptism of converts received into the Church by another method. To understand why a few of his private letters seem to suggest a contrary view to what has been presented in the above publications, it is critical to understand the context of his personal letters and his concern over the influence of Father Panteleimon and Roquefort, and particularly the effort of Father Panteleimon to bring Roquefort into alignment with the extreme and sectarian ecclesiology of the Mathewite Greek Old Calendarists. Father Seraphim's letters, Father Panteleimon, and Mathewite Ecclesiology in Roquefort. Father Panteleimon was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1935, and went to Mount Athos in 1956, where he was tonsured into monasticism, before returning to America just 2 years later in 1958. He was ordained a deacon by Bishop Athenagoras of Boston of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, and was afterwards ordained a priest while on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In America, Father Panteleimon established Holy Transfiguration Monastery, which eventually settled in Brookline, Massachusetts, near Boston. In 1965, many among the faithful Orthodox Christians throughout the world were shocked and scandalized when Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras and Pope Paul VI lifted the anathemas of 1054 without first resolving the dogmatic issues that led to the Great Schism between the Orthodox Church and the papacy. By 1054, the Pope of Rome and his followers had accepted the insertion of the heretical filioque clause into the Nicene Creed, among other serious deviations from the apostolic tradition. Between 1054 and 1965, the Pope and his followers adopted many other heretical teachings, including that of purgatory, papal infallibility, and false teachings concerning original sin and the Immaculate Conception of the Theotokos. Patriarch Athenagoras, in lifting the anathemas against Pope Paul VI and all of his followers, acted unilaterally without the blessing and approval of the other local Orthodox churches, and without any regard for the fact that the Pope and his followers had not repented of the heresy that led to the Great Schism, nor the heresies that they had adopted since. In response to this scandalous act, Metropolitan Philaret of Roquefort wrote 3 sorrowful epistles to Patriarch Athenagoras to protect his act and to call him to repentance. Seeing the patristic stance of Metropolitan Philaret and Roquefort, Father Panteleimon and Holy Transfiguration Monastery, along with several clergy and parishes that were associated with the monastery, petitioned Roquefort and were received that same year. In the January-February 1967 edition of the Orthodox Word, Father Seraphim wrote a very positive article about Father Panteleimon and HTM, praising them as, quote, one of the few solid islands of genuine orthodoxy in the vast sea of contemporary American religious life, unquote. Initially, Father Seraphim and Father Panteleimon seemed to be of one mind. Both were committed to establishing traditional Orthodox monasticism in America. Both were committed to missionary activity, to spread traditional Orthodoxy in the English-speaking world. Both were committed to translating and disseminating traditional Orthodox materials in the English language, and both were opposed to false ecumenism and modernist innovations. Father Panteleimon visited the fathers in Platina, and even sent money to help the fathers purchase a new printing press. Father Seraphim corresponded with Father Panteleimon very warmly in these years, and even wrote to seek his advice, saying that the spiritual bond between St. Herman's and HTM was most close. However, the relationship between the two monasteries became increasingly strained. Beginning in 1973, after Alexei Young, a close spiritual child of Father Seraphim, published articles on the Shrouded Turin and evolution in his Nicodemus publication that drew harsh criticism from the Greeks that were aligned with Father Panteleimon in HTM. Father Seraphim had reviewed both articles and provided Alexei with plenty of feedback prior to publication. But while Father Seraphim was fairly pleased with the publication of the article on evolution, unfortunately, Alexei sent out the article on the Shroud without addressing the problems and concerns Father Seraphim had raised. Father Seraphim was not primarily upset that those within Father Panteleimon's sphere of influence disagreed with these articles, but it was how they expressed their disagreement that disturbed him. By April 11, 1973, the attack against Alexei's article from Father Panteleimon's circle of influence became so intense that Father Seraphim wrote adamantly to Alexei stating, quote, "In strongest fashion, we now urge you, do not enter into any argument whatever with anyone over evolution or the Shroud at this time. If someone wants to provoke you into an argument, give him a reply such as you gave to Father Ephraim's letter, but do not argue. All letters to bishops or anyone else either. The dust is too thick, and arguing will only make it thicker, no matter who is right or wrong, and it will be spiritually very harmful for you. Don't even think about these two subjects until the dust settles, if you can help it." Unquote. Between 1973 and 1975, it became increasingly clear that there were other problems with Father Panteleimon and his growing influence in ROCOR. Far beyond simple disagreements about two articles, on August 26, September 8, 1975, Father Seraphim wrote to Dr. Alexander Kalomiros in Greece regarding these concerns and Father Panteleimon's efforts to join the Matthewites. Quote, "From many sources, from Father Theodoritos on Mount Athos, from you, and from people in this country, both Greeks and Americans and also Russians, and from our own experience, we have now formed a rather complete picture of Father Panteleimon. And this picture is a sad one. The man is very talented, very aware of contemporary Orthodox events, has the right view on most Orthodox matters, and has in general the correct feeling of Orthodoxy. From the beginning we have supported him, and our articles about him, and his monastery and our Orthodox word have undoubtedly helped him to grow and gain influence. It has therefore been with great sorrow that in the past 2 or 3 years we have begun to notice very dangerous characteristics in him. He wrote us in a letter 2 years ago that Father Panteleimon seems to want to have all Greek Orthodox in America under him. At about that same time, we are noticing that he also wants to have all American Orthodox under him. He tried, for example, to ridicule and destroy our friend Alexei Young, whose small periodical, Nicodemus, is very helpful in inspiring Orthodox Americans and guiding them in the faith. Father Panteleimon did not like it because it had 1 or 2 articles with which he disagreed. Father Nikitas Palesius even threatened to attack Alexei publicly, a fellow Orthodox Christian and a sister periodical in the same church. Soon it became obvious why Father Panteleimon was doing this. He and his followers think that he alone is truly Orthodox in our synod, and that almost all the Russians are backward, theologically naive, and under Western influence. And only Father Panteleimon and his followers are true theologians, sophisticated, free of all unorthodox influences, and able to lead everyone else in true orthodoxy. He never attacked our brotherhood directly, but after a while it became apparent that he was waging a campaign against us in private. And now we have the testimony of several people that he warns people against us, apparently because we are Russians and do not ask him for advice, and do not even have a telephone, so he can call us up and correct us whenever he feels like it. From this attitude of Father Panteleimon's, which is very foreign to what our instructors in the faith have handed down to us, we have great apprehension for the future. It seems already clear what is going to happen. Father P is going to seize upon some situation in which he can show himself to be correct, in order to break communion with our synod. Then he will have himself made bishop by all the Matthewites, and will be the only Orthodox bishop in America, over Greeks and Americans, and even over Russians. His position will not be entirely consistent, but many young Americans and Greek Americans, and even some Russo-Americans, will follow him. Why? Because Father P has a real power over a certain type of Orthodox Americans. Not over real Greeks or Russians, I think. You are right in this. Over those who are new or inexperienced or uncertain in the faith, and need an authority to tell them what to do. We have long ago noticed that it is not possible to hold a discussion with Father Panteleimon. He is always correct, no matter what he says or does, even though in actual fact we have found that he is quite ignorant in some areas of knowledge of the Holy Fathers. Ignorant not just of facts, but of the very tradition of the handling down of the patristic teaching. This is to be expected, since he went to a modernist Greek seminary and taught himself the Holy Fathers, i.e., did not receive it in a continuous tradition from the past, such as still exists in our Russian church abroad, even if our bishops and priests are not sophisticated. Father P laughs at the seminary education of Jordanville, but even if it might be very simple, still this education continues to breathe the spirit of orthodoxy, which Father Panteleimon does not entirely possess. It would be very good if he could write an article for our Orthodox Word on how to keep alive the true savor of orthodoxy, in view of the many temptations besetting us today, without, however, mentioning as yet any names. If the worst does happen, and Father Panteleimon goes to the Matthewites, then we will probably have to publish an attack against the Matthewites as an error on the right hand, with true orthodoxy standing between the modernists on the one hand and the legalist fanatics on the other hand. But if Father P does leave the synod, it will be very difficult for us zealots who remain, because as you know, some of our bishops are trying to maintain communion with ecumenical orthodoxy, which is a disastrous and fatal path. But we trust that God allows all these difficult and bitter trials to come upon us for our salvation, and so that we can be of help to others." Unquote. Father Seraphim expressed the concern, which turned out to be prophetic, that Father Panteleimon would eventually look for some excuse to break communion with the Repose Synod and join the Mathewites. In fact, only 4 years after Father Seraphim's repose, Father Panteleimon and several clergy and parishes associated with the monastery suddenly broke away from Repose to join the old calendarists on September 29th, October 12th, 1975. Father Seraphim wrote to Father Igor, later Hilarion, who became the Metropolitan of Repose in 2008. Quote, "We are in correspondence with Dr. Alexander Kalomiros in Greece, who himself writes us despairing letters concerning the actions of Father Panteleimon in Greece, without the blessing or knowledge of his own bishop, in favor of the Mathewite schism, which Dr. Kalomiros calls real fanaticism and legalism." Unquote. As Father Damascene relates regarding Father Panteleimon in his effort to bring Repose into alignment with Mathewite Ecclesiology, quote, "Going to Greece, the super-correct faction tried to create political ties between the Russian Church abroad and the most extreme of all old calendar groups, the Mathewites, who believed that not only were all of the new calendar churches without grace, but any church that had anything at all to do with them was also graceless. This plan later backfired, for the Mathewites learned that contrary to what they had been led to believe, the Russian church abroad was far too liberal for them. Unquote. Father Panteleimon's ecclesiological sympathies manifested themselves in a variety of ways that caused Father Seraphim great unease. In a January 28th, February 10th, 1976 letter to Alexei Young, in the context of his growing concerns about Father Panteleimon and the promotion of a Mathewite ecclesiology within ROCOR, Father Seraphim spoke of his increasing concerns about the hothouse approach to orthodoxy, which he associated with Father Panteleimon. Since his letter is also the main letter reference regarding Father Seraphim's views on the reception of converts and corrective baptism, it is worth quoting and examining in full. Quote, January 28th, February 10th, 1976, St. Ephrem the Syrian. Dear Alexei, enclosed is a new fruit. Unfortunately, most reprints, but we hope the cover is new and inspiring. In our visit, we didn't have a chance to ask you how Nina is getting along in the community. Is she getting a longing for big city life? She told me that she and Barbara are not getting along, and she thinks it must be jealousy. Could it be that Barbara just can't stand Nina's type? Outspoken, intellectual, always right, still reflecting something of the hothouse atmosphere of the Boston approach? I've written and talked to Nina some about this hothouse approach to orthodoxy. Filled with gossip, knowing what's going on, having the right answer, to everything according to what the experts say. I began to think that this is really her basic problem, and not Father Panteleimon directly. An example, Nina is horrified that Father Herman's brother-in-law was received into the church from Roman Catholicism without baptism or chrismation. That's wrong, she says, but we say nothing particularly wrong with that. It is for the priest and the bishop to decide, and it is not our, or even more her business. The rite by which she was received has long been approved by the church out of economy. And probably in this case it was the best way, because Harvey might have hesitated much more at being baptized. The church's condescension here was wise, but Nina would like somebody to read Vladica Anthony, the decree of the sober. My dear, he was there composing the decree, which explicitly gives the bishop permission to use economy when he wishes. We don't like this attitude at all, because it introduces totally unnecessary disturbance into the church atmosphere. And if she is going to tell Harvey, now that he is not really baptized or a member of the Orthodox Church, she could do untold harm to his soul. Another example, Nina was very pleased that her Daniel was baptized in Jordanville after having been a member of the Russian Church abroad for several years. Finally, he did it right. Our Lawrence thinks the same thing, but we are not pleased at all, seeing in this a sign of great spiritual immaturity on his part, and a narrow fanaticism on the part of those who approve. St. Basil the Great refused to baptize a man who doubted the validity of his baptism, precisely because he had already received communion for many years, and it was too late to doubt then that he was a member of Christ's church. In the case of our converts, it is obvious that those who insist or are talked into receiving baptism after already being members of the church are trying out a feeling of insecurity to receive something which the sacrament does not give, psychological security, and making up for the past failures while already orthodox, and belonging to the club of those who are right, and automatic spiritual correctness. But this act casts doubt on the church and her ministers. If the priest or bishop who received such people are wrong, and so wrong that the whole act of reception must be done over again, a sort of church within the church is created, a clique which, by contrast to most bishops and priests, is always right. And of course, that is our big problem today. And even more in the days ahead, it is very difficult to fight this, because they offer clear and simple answers to every question, and our insecure converts find this the answer to their needs. I wonder if Honorios will not have this problem. He is hesitant about just going to confession to be joined to our church, especially after hearing what his friend Makarios was baptized in Jordanville. When I asked him whether he thought he had to be baptized too. He said no, just as long as he's given a clear answer as to what he should do. So we told him we would ask Vladika Anthony's blessing for him to be received, and how. But frankly, no matter what anyone might think or say, our church has never broken communion with the Greek Archdiocese. And in fact, Metropolitan Philaret's latest epistle to the bishops of the Patriarchate at Constantinople still addresses them as Orthodox bishops. I suspect that any priest in his diocese would be horrified at the idea of baptizing someone who comes from the Greek Archdiocese. But in this case, let us see what Vladika Anthony says, and then pray that no one is coming to disturb Phanarios afterwards with tempting thoughts of solving all of his problems by baptism. At times we like to think that the whole Father Panteleimon's problem in our church is just a matter of differing emphases, which, in the end, will not be so terribly important. But the more we observe, the more we come to think that it is much more serious than that. That in the fact, an Orthodox sectarianism is being formed at the expense of our simple people. Therefore, those who are aware of all of this must be zealots according to knowledge. The Church has survived worse temptations in the past, but we fear for our converts, lest their simplicity they be led into a sect and out of the Church. God is with us. We must go forward in faith, with love, Seraphim monk. Unquote. Father Herman's brother-in-law was received into the Orthodox Church without baptism and chrismation, which truly was unheard of in the history of the Church prior to the very problematic 1666 to 1667 Moscow Council. At the 1620 Moscow Council, Patriarch Filaret Romanov of Moscow and of all Russia declared, quote, "Since the beginning of the state of Moscow until now, there has never been a case where Latin heretics and heretics of other faiths were not baptized, except for the case of Ignatius the Patriarch, who was deposed from his episcopal throne." Patriarch Filaret was here referring to Patriarch Ignatius of Moscow and all Russia, who was deposed in 1606 for receiving a convert from the Latins by chrismation. He was succeeded by Saint Hermogenes, the wonder worker, and Patriarch of all Russia, who also upheld the practice of receiving all converts by baptism, and who instructed his successor, Patriarch Filaret, to do the same. Regarding Father Seraphim's response to St. Basil in the context of Daniel's corrective baptism, Father Seraphim seems to be referring not to the story about St. Basil, but rather about St. Dionysius of Alexandria, with some slight deviations from the original. St. Dionysius wrote to Pope Xistus out of fear of being in error for not baptizing the man, writing, quote, "For truly, brother, I am in need of counsel, and I ask thy judgment concerning a certain matter which has come to me, fearing that I may be in error." Unquote. We do not know how Pope Xistus responded to the letter of St. Dionysius, or whether the man in question was afterwards baptized. The story shows the all too common experience converts have when they are not received by baptism, and it shows the internal struggle that St. Dionysius had, fearing that he perhaps was wrong for not having baptized the man after the man had been in the church for a period of time. The concerns Father Seraphim expresses about Daniel's corrective baptism at Jordanville and Nina's views concerning it do not appear to be motivated so much by his views on the corrective baptism per se, as by his concerns about Nina and Daniel personally, and the unhealthy influence of Father Panteleimon on both them and other converts. This is highlighted by the lack of appeal of Father Seraphim to the teachings of the saints and the canons on this topic, aside from a vague reference to St. Basil, which was probably referring instead to St. Dionysius, and the fact that Father Seraphim began and ended the letter expressing concern about the influence of Father Panteleimon, only mentioning these cases of reception in the context of this overarching concern. Father Seraphim wrote more than 300 personal letters, including several letters directly to Nina Seckel and Daniel Oliver, and letters written to others in which Nina and Daniel are mentioned. Father Seraphim had stated in 1973 that Nina was under Father Panteleimon's spiritual direction, and had helped establish Holy Nativity Convent near HTM under Father Panteleimon's guidance. She eventually left the convent, but remained under Father Panteleimon's direction and influence. In an October 2nd/15th, 1975 letter to Alexei, prior to the letter above about Daniel's corrective baptism, Father Seraphim said, quote, "Concerning Nina, I had just written you a letter, superseded by this one, saying that if Nina is being defensive about Father Panteleimon, it may well be that she has not quite cut the ties after all. If she doesn't, she's going to have trouble ahead. Well, the trouble seems to be here, and Nina will have no peace until she either does make a complete cut with Father P, or else joins his sect, because the way they are going, our Greeks will not be long with us, and it is hardly conceivable that they will stay long with the Matthewites either, unless there is much politics or money involved behind the scenes." Unquote. A week later, Father Seraphim wrote directly to Nina on October 9th, 22nd, 1975, expressing the same concerns about the influence of Father Panteleimon and the tone he was setting, and wrote, course, saying, quote, "Thanks also for the letters which gave the Boston version of recent events. We didn't like the tone at all, oily, self-justifying, and rumor-mongering. It is our Greeks who have now introduced into our church the spirit of party politics, false zealotry, and suspicion. If they can't see this, it's pointless to talk to them." Unquote. These concerns express, to and about Nina, the influence of Father Panteleimon on her, and the fear that she would follow Father Panteleimon and the other Greeks into schism, preceded his comments regarding Daniel's corrective baptism in 1976. A few years later, in 1979, Father Seraphim would remark that Nina, quote, "has always been an unquestioning follower of Father Panteleimon," unquote. And as Father Seraphim feared, Nina did follow Father Panteleimon into schism in 1986, 4 years after Father Seraphim's repose. Between 1970 and 1976, Father Seraphim had considerable correspondence with Daniel Olson, the one who had received the corrective baptism at Jordanville in 1976. And Father Seraphim spoke of him in several personal letters to others. In an April 9th, 1973 letter to Father Nikitas, Father Seraphim mentions that after spending time at Platina, Daniel Olson made his final decision to go to Father Panteleimon for good. And Father Seraphim considered this an offering of Platina to HTM, as relations between the two monasteries at that time were positive. Daniel did not remain with Father Panteleimon, however, but returned to Platina only to again leave. In a January 7th/20, 1976 letter to Alexei, Father Seraphim said, quote, "We ourselves had had a number of sobering experiences by now, especially with people in whom we had great trust or hopes. Daniel was one of them. He could have turned out a zealous and fruitful laborer in Christ's vineyard. But now, on his 2-day visit to us just now, we noticed that, while he is not loose as he was in his previous 2 visits, when he was out of work, still he has the same self-centered, self-satisfied view of reality, knowing so much about orthodoxy and having so many correct feelings about the Orthodox situation. Also, he probably will never bear fruit now that he has let his opportunity for commitment, first with Father Panteleimon, then with us, slip by. We fear he will even bring harm, quite without intending it, merely from being correct, without being able to commit his heart to anything or anyone." Unquote. In the January 26th, February 10th, 1976 letter to Alexei Young above, Father Seraphim was writing to Alexei about Nina's hothouse approach to orthodoxy that reflected the Boston approach of Father Panteleimon in HTM. Father Seraphim used the references to Nina's attitude about the reception and corrective baptism. Only to illustrate, he begins these paragraphs with an example and another example. His main concern, which was the tone and approach to orthodoxy of Father Panteleimon, and the likelihood that those sharing in his mentality would end up in schism. If Father Seraphim was primarily concerned about the justification, or lack thereof, of corrective baptism, from a dogmatic point of view, then we would likely see him discuss these matters in the context of the canons of the Church and the teachings of the saints and fathers, as he was more than capable of doing. Following Daniel's corrective baptism, Father Seraphim wrote 2 letters to Daniel that same year, but did not bring up the topic of his corrective baptism. Instead, he wrote extensively about his growing concerns about the Greek Old Calendarist, about the likelihood of Father Panteleimon going into schism from ROCOR, and about relations between ROCOR and the other canonical Orthodox churches being strained, but not entirely broken, since Father Panteleimon and his circle claimed that ROCOR was not in communion with any of the canonical Orthodox churches. On May 29th, June 11th, 1976, Father Seraphim wrote to Daniel, quote, Father Panteleimon and the Greeks who follow him have formed a kind of autonomous psychological diocese within our church, and it is obvious that they trust and respect none of our bishops. They look for their authority rather to Greece, and in Greece the situation becomes more confused every day, so that it is Father Panteleimon's thinking alone that becomes their authority. This is a terribly dangerous situation, and it seems inevitable that unless our Greeks change the tone of their zealotry, it is only a matter of time until they leave us, whether for the Matthewites or to form their own jurisdiction, which will only confuse matters more. Already, Father Panteleimon practices selective communion with our church, as when he refused to serve at the funeral of Archbishop Averki, but stood in the altar with a group of his priests and monks. Father Panteleimon of Jordanville, when he saw this, told Father Herman, who was able to be present, to bid farewell to his Abba. Look what kind of monks we have now. They come here to make a demonstration. It must be the end of the world. This is typical of the attitude of our church to the too eager zealots of our day. Without bitterness or indignation, but with a deep and calm awareness that this is not the answer, unquote. Regarding Father Seraphim's views expressed in the January 28th, February 10th, 1976 letter concerning Father Herman's brother-in-law's reception into the church and Daniel's corrective baptism, Father Alexei Young, now Hiroshima monk Ambrose, the close spiritual child of Father Seraphim's, who published many letters, Father Seraphim wrote him over their 12 years of correspondence, included the following footnote in the book after these stories, quote, It should be noted that in the 23 years since Father Seraphim wrote this, the situation of the heterodox churches and the modernist Orthodox jurisdictions has deteriorated to a degree that Father Seraphim could not have predicted, and which would have horrified him. In general, the Russian church abroad now finds it necessary as well as appropriate to insist on the use of less economy, a more pastoral strictness, in order to avoid unfortunate cases of scruples later on. This, however, has nothing whatever to do with the sectarian and extremely legalistic mindset of those few who deny the existence of grace in the new calendar jurisdictions, unquote. In this same January 28th, February 10th, 1976 letter to Alexei, Father Seraphim also speaks of the reception of Venorius Ingram into ROCOR. Father Seraphim expressed his concerns about whether Venorius would accept being received into ROCOR by confession rather than by baptism, since Venorius' friend, Makarios, had been received into ROCOR by baptism. Venorius had been baptized in the Greek Archdiocese. This was not an example of the corrective baptism of someone who had never been baptized in the Orthodox Church and had been previously received by economy without the canonical presuppositions for the application of economy. Rather, this concerned the reception into ROCOR by baptism of someone who had already been baptized correctly in the Orthodox Church. Here, Father Seraphim did not express his views as to how Phanarios should be received into ROCOR, but said he would ask Vladika Anthony how Phanarios should be received, and hope Phanarios would accept what Vladika Anthony decided. Father Seraphim said that priests in his diocese would likely be horrified at the idea of baptizing someone who has already been baptized in the Greek Archdiocese, so he likely assumed that Vladika Anthony would not require that Phanarios be received by baptism. This letter concludes by Father Seraphim again expressing the overarching concern with which he had started the letter, that converts under Father Panteleimon's influence might be led into his sect and out of the Church. With regard to the reception of Phanarios, Father Seraphim was referring to the fact that some who were under the influence of Father Panteleimons, Mathewite, Ecclesiology, were insisting that the Greek Archdiocese was outside of the Orthodox Church and no longer had grace in their mysteries, and as such, those who were baptized in the Greek Archdiocese should be received into ROCOR by baptism. Father Seraphim expressed opposition to this practice because ROCOR had never officially broken communion with the Greek Archdiocese, nor declared their mysteries to be without grace. Father Damascene relates, quote, in 1976, the English-speaking Orthodox mission was also struck a blow. When people, mostly insecure converts, who had been baptized in other canonical Orthodox churches, were directed by the super-correct contingent to get rebaptized in the Russian church abroad, unquote. In this year, 1976, Father Seraphim wrote several letters concerning rebaptisms, done in Guildford, England, as well as in America. And these rebaptisms were not corrective baptisms, as defined previously, but concern the reception into ROCOR by baptism of those already baptized in other Orthodox jurisdictions. On April 18th, May 1st, 1976, Father Seraphim wrote to Andrew Bond in England, quote, we have heard of a few mistaken rebaptisms in America, and have asked several of our bishops about them. In any case, as it turns out, the diocesan bishop was not informed of the circumstances of the case. Recently, some wished to see such a rebaptism performed in our Western American diocese, but our Archbishop Anthony wisely refused to allow it, in which we gave him our full support, for indeed, it would have been tantamount to open declaration of the absence of grace in the Greek Archdiocese, unquote. On May 22nd, June 4th, 1976, Father Seraphim wrote again to Andrew Bond regarding the latter's concern with these rebaptisms. Quote, if I am not mistaken, what most upset you about the Guildford baptisms was the fanatical tone it introduced into Orthodoxy in England. If this matter of reception from other jurisdictions is to become the norm, then our church is in danger of falling into a Mathewite sectarianism. In this our bishops refuse to be legalistic to declare that those jurisdictions are schismatic, and therefore devoid of grace. That is the Mathewite approach, which Father Panteleimon would apparently like to see prevail in our church. Even today our bishops refuse to define in this manner, and make everything black and white. And I am sure that, perhaps without exception, our bishops not only refuse to declare them without grace, but positively believe, at least by giving the benefit of any doubt, that they do have grace. Father P. would like to be their spokesman, and tell the world what our bishops should be believing. But here he is going out on a limb, which one day is going to break beneath him, unquote. In a letter to Alexei Young on July 14, 27, 1976, Father Seraphim explained that he was not totally against receiving people from other Orthodox jurisdictions by baptism in some cases, as long as this was not done as a rule, and did not set a fanatical tone, or imply the absence of grace in another Orthodox jurisdiction. He wrote, quote, out of all this we see the necessity for the formulation of a sound, moderate stand, that will emphasize true orthodoxy, firmly oppose ecumenism and modernism, but not go overboard in defining such things as a presence or absence of grace, or practicing rebaptism of those already orthodox. We accept that in some cases this might be allowable, with the bishop's approval, but beyond a few isolated cases, this practice itself introduces a fanatical tone and a spirit of discord and distrust in the church. This will be extremely difficult to do, especially with the presence among us of a politically powerful fanatic. But with God's help and the prayers of our patron saints, we will try our best to do our little bit." Unquote. Father Seraphim here does not elaborate on what specific cases he would accept the reception of other Orthodox into row core by baptism. Apostolic Canon 47 forbids bishops and priests from baptizing again anyone who has had a true baptism in the Orthodox Church, defined in Apostolic Canon 50 as 3 full immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity, which supports Father Seraphim's concern that baptizing those already baptized correctly in another Orthodox jurisdiction would imply that jurisdiction was outside of the Church and without a sacramental grace. Canon 80 of the Council of Carthage in AD 419 and Canon 84 of the 5th-6th Ecumenical Council, also referred to as the Quintus Ecumenical Council or just the 6th Ecumenical Council, state that if there is any uncertainty as to whether a person had been baptized correctly in the Church, and no witnesses could confirm this, that they must be baptized without putting any obstacle in the way, lest any such hesitation may deprive them of such purifying sanctification. There are no canons forbidding the baptism of those who were received into the Church by a method other than baptism in 3 immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity. So it should not be surprising that there would be cases where Orthodox from other jurisdictions would be received into row core by baptism if they had never been baptized in 3 immersions in the Orthodox Church. Again, Father Seraphim had published just a case regarding row core's baptism of Father George Lewis coming from the Orthodox Church in America, formerly the Metropolia. Andrew Bond in England was very much against row core receiving Orthodox from other jurisdictions by baptism as a matter of course, and was very vocal about his opposition to this practice. Because of Andrew's outspokenness, his bishop, Archbishop Nicodeme, wrote to Andrew, calling for his repentance. About this, Father Seraphim wrote to Alexei on July 14, 1976. Quote, "Andrew sent us a copy of Archbishop Nicodeme's epistle, to him asking for his repentance. The hand of Father Panteleimon seems evident in this incident, and Archbishop Nicodeme seems to have been placed in the unfortunate political situation of having to accept, as his defender, someone with whose views I really doubt he is in full accord. However, in that situation, nothing further is possible for the good, unless Andrew does what the Archbishop wants. Ask forgiveness of the clergy whom he has offended." We strongly urged Andrew to do this in written form, emphasizing to him that this does not mean changing his opinions about rebaptism, but only apologizing for any crudeness, etc., which he may have shown, which, judging from his letters to us, he probably has shown. We haven't heard further from him yet." Unquote. Father Seraphim did not agree with establishing a rule of receiving other Orthodox into row core by baptism, and agreed with Andrew's objection to this practice. However, for peace and unity of the Church, Father Seraphim instructed Andrew to repent for how he behaved in speaking out about this issue, while not changing his correct views on the topic. While Father Seraphim is well known for warning about the temptation from the right, referred to in these letters, often what is left out is Father Seraphim's characterization of the temptation from the right, particularly in the context of the Mathewite Old Calendarist Ecclesiology, as well as his equal concerns about the temptation from the left. Father Seraphim described the temptation from the right as characterized by a prideful attitude, thinking that you always know better than others, criticism of others, publicly and disparagingly, speaking out against others who disagree with you, preoccupation with church politics, spreading rumors, and readiness to condemn local Orthodox churches as without grace, prior to a pan-Orthodox or ecumenical council. Father Seraphim mourned just as much, however, with the temptation on the left, characterized by modernism, ecumenism, and an academic approach to orthodoxy that ceases to be a living tradition received from the saints of our times and faithfully preserved. To Andrew Bond in England, after warning about the temptation on the right, Father Seraphim said, quote, "To all this I would only add, let us also beware of the temptations on the left side. We do not need to declare fanatically that we are the only Orthodox left. But let us also be aware of the process of apostasy that is taking possession of virtually all of the Orthodox churches now, into which we too can fall if we are not sober and cautious." Unquote. Father Seraphim saw the temptations from the left and from the right as two expressions of the same problem of pride and excessive trust in one's own opinions. Quote, "We cannot follow the line of Boston Orthodoxy, which is actually a kind of right wing of Parisian Orthodoxy, a Reformed Orthodoxy, which happens to be mostly correct, but is actually just as much outside the tradition of Orthodoxy as is Paris, just as much the creation of human logic." Unquote. Regarding the need to receive orthodoxy from the saints of our time, and not simply trust our own minds, our own abilities, and whatever theological education we may have received, Father Seraphim said, quote, "In our confused days, when 100 conflicting voices claim to speak for orthodoxy, it is essential to know whom one can trust as a spokesman for true orthodoxy. It is not enough to claim to speak for patristic orthodoxy. One must be willing, in the genuine tradition of the Holy Fathers, not merely rediscovering them in a modern academy or seminary, but actually receiving their tradition from one's own fathers. A merely clever explainer of patristic doctrine is not in this tradition, but only one who, not trusting his own judgment or that of his peers, is constantly asking of his own fathers what is the proper approach to an understanding of the Holy Fathers." Unquote. While Father Seraphim appeared to criticize the corrective baptism of Daniel in his January 28th, February 10th, 1976 letter to Alexei Young, in the same year he expressed more openness to the practice in the context of the rebaptism controversy in Guildford, England. None of the over 300 letters from Father Seraphim that are publicly available show how Father Seraphim understood and applied the canons, the writings of the Fathers, with the exception of the St. Basil reference that looks to be mistakenly attributed to St. Basil instead of St. Dionysius, and ecumenical councils to the topic of the reception of converts and corrective baptism. It is clear that his concern expressed in his personal letters was primarily pastoral, and was preoccupied with trying to guide the faithful away from the influence of Father Panteleimon and a circle who were pushing for Rocourt to adopt the Ecclesiology of the Mathewite Old Calendarists, which viewed all Orthodox patriarchates at that time as outside of the Church and without grace. His focus in these letters was not on what was correct or who was right, but in maintaining peace and unity in Rocourt and avoiding a disastrous schism during a very tumultuous time, when relations were strained between Rocourt and other canonical Orthodox churches, and an influential contingent within Rocourt were campaigning for Rocourt to cut off all ties with canonical Orthodox churches and denounce them as graceless. While not concerning himself primarily with what was true and correct regarding the reception of converts and corrective baptism, Father Seraphim was not indifferent to the importance of truth and correctness. Rather, he wrote about the main problem facing Rocourt at that particular time. Those who had seemingly correct opinions, but who were nevertheless falling into pride, delusion, and sectarianism because they had not cultivated the virtues of humility and love, while also striving to know and defend the truth. Of course, we must do what is good in a good way, but following and defending the truth with a humble and loving heart, purified of the passions. Father Seraphim on obedience to hierarchs. As shown above, Father Seraphim did not take a strong position on the manner by which converts should be received, nor on the topic of corrective baptism, on the basis of the canons of the Church and patristic teaching, but rather responded pastorally to the situations he was addressing in his letters, with deference to the bishops who would make the final determinations regarding individual receptions. Most of the letters from Father Seraphim pertaining to these topics were written prior to his ordination to the priesthood in 1977, so naturally he could not himself receive anyone into the Church during this time. Father Seraphim certainly respected the hierarchical structure of the Church and spoke of the need to obey one's bishops, yet he also understood that such obedience must not be blind, but must be with discernment. While certain people within ROCOR were claiming that other local Orthodox churches were without grace, Father Seraphim was right to point out that it is the bishops who must make a determination on this matter, and not individual priests or laypeople. However, in other instances, Father Seraphim was very cautious about following bishops who he did not believe were being guided by the Holy Spirit. And while he had great regard for certain bishops in ROCOR during his time, he did not necessarily have equal regard for the authority of all bishops in all Orthodox jurisdictions. In 1971, Father Seraphim and Father Herman were greatly troubled by the attempt of their Archbishop Anthony to demand their absolute obedience to himself as abbot of their monastery. It seemed that Archbishop Anthony wanted absolute control over the life of the monastery, though he lived in San Francisco, not Platina. And Father Seraphim was greatly concerned that Archbishop Anthony would divert the monastery from the original purpose for which it was established, with the blessing of St. John of San Francisco. Expressing his grief over this trial and seeking advice from others whom he respected, Father Seraphim wrote on January 4th, 17th, 1971, to Father Panteleimon, abbot of the Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston, with whom he and Father Herman had a great deal of trust and respect at that time, prior to the development of Father Panteleimon's more sectarian tendencies. Quote, "Dear Father, you know us well enough to know that we are in all things obedient and respectful of legitimate ecclesiastical authority, and that we have never tried to impose any kind of authority over others. This, if anything, is our great weakness, or seek for ourselves any kind of position or tithe in the Church. But if it now comes down to practicing humility and obedience, and allowing a complete outsider to take over and destroy our work, our conscience will not allow it. Please tell us if we are wrong. We have thus been led into a situation where, in order to preserve our independence and continue our orthodox word as before, we will have sooner or later to show open disobedience to our Archbishop, insofar as he regards himself as our abbot. And we believe that he, being of an extremely dominating character, will try to crush this disobedience, even if he has to break us or destroy our work in doing it." Unquote. Father Seraphim's understanding was that after Archbishop Anthony tonsured Father Herman and himself into monasticism, he would then appoint either Father Seraphim or Father Herman as abbot. The fathers were then surprised when the Archbishop later insisted that he was in fact the abbot and demanded complete control over the life and work of the monastery. Father Seraphim sought advice on this matter also from Bishop Laurus, who became Metropolitan of ROCOR in 2001, and expressed his understanding of true and false obedience in the context of Archbishop Anthony's attempt to establish St. Herman's Monastery as a diocesan monastery under his control. Father Seraphim wrote, quote, "But such obedience for the sake of a worldly end is very clearly spiritually illegitimate. We are the disciples of Vladika John, who blessed and inspired our work from the very beginning, and we firmly believe is with us now in spirit. It is to his blessing, in fact, that we ascribe entirely whatever success we have had so far, and from him we have learned above canons, church discipline, etc., comes his spirit, if by obedience, by faithfulness to the letter of the canons, or by any other thing, good in itself, the spirit of a man is crushed and is extinguished, then there is something terribly wrong." Unquote. In another letter, Father Seraphim elaborated further on this same situation, stating that true and blessed obedience cannot be a form of slavery. But now we are prepared to stand up and fight for the independence which the Church and its canons guarantee to monasteries. Monastic obedience cannot possibly be slavery. If that were true, then the Church would be divided up into slaves and tyrants. Some people in the Church at various times have tried to enforce this perverted concept, but it does not come from the Church or from monasticism. All Orthodox Christians, and especially monks and nuns, are trying to cut off their own will and lead a God-pleasing life. But to meekly bow down to tyranny, most especially when this tyranny only destroys a God-pleasing work and extinguishes the Christian and monastic spirit in its victims, is certainly only a parody and a mockery of Orthodox monasticism. We are absolutely resolved in all obedience to the Church and lawful ecclesiastical authority, not to become a part of any such mockery." Unquote. The same year, 1971, in another letter, Father Seraphim elaborated further on what he perceived as a distorted form of obedience that Archbishop Anthony seemed to be demanding of the Fathers, which Father Seraphim said they would accept only over dead bodies. Quote, "In the prevailing Russian understanding, today, a monastery is a place with an incidental collection of people, with a definite function in the Church, to serve as a bishop's summer residence, picnic center, manpower pool for church needs, etc. And monks are those people who become slaves, crushed by the authorities for the sake of obedience, who can be used by the church organization, the more hopeful ones as bishops, the less hopeful ones as hieromonks, in parishes that can't afford anything better, and the complete fools to remain in the monastery and tend the cows. Against such a perverted idea, both of monasteries and of obedience and the monastic virtues, we emphatically protest. And if God grants us to have a real monastery here, it will fit into this accepted picture only over our dead bodies." Unquote. Father Seraphim especially saw the problem of harmful obedience in the case of the Church in Russia during his life, where the Soviets exerted tremendous pressure and control over bishops there. In a letter to Alexei Young on May 29, June 11, 1973, Father Seraphim said concerning this, quote, "We are already in the age of unbiased bishops, which St. Seraphim prophesied, and already in many places, most notably Russia, a degree of hiding from, or even outright disobedience to bishops has already become a spiritual necessity, and one which it is by no means easy to justify, always on dogmatic or canonical grounds. This by no means changes the rule, which you cite, about obedience to bishops. But alas, there are people also in our Russian Church abroad who are only too anxious to take advantage of such rules, not for the good of the Church or the bishops, but for their own private purposes." Unquote. Father Seraphim understood that, as a rule, obedience to one's bishop is necessary, but this rule of obedience can also be exploited by bishops to the detriment of the Church, since this rule presupposes that the bishops are holy, purified of their passions, guided by the Holy Spirit, and governed in their decisions chiefly by what is best for the Church and for man's salvation. When these presuppositions are not met, much damage can result. Indeed, such holy bishops guided by the Holy Spirit are not common, neither today nor in Father Seraphim's time. However, Father Seraphim knew such a God-bearing bishop from the first years of his life in the Church, St. John of Shanghai, and San Francisco. Hence, as Father Seraphim continued publishing the Orthodox Word and began his labors as a monastic under St. John's successor, Archbishop Anthony, the example of St. John's holiness as a bishop, made it especially clear exactly what is true leadership and what is worldly and tyrannical leadership. Father Seraphim wrote to Alexei Young on October 18th, 31st, 1972, quote, "In our days, a general discipline, one should not expect too much of them, i.e. bishops. While giving them all due honor and respect and obedience, one must realistically acknowledge that, save in rare cases, they are not in a position to serve as our personal guides, least of all to converts. The one outstanding exception to this general rule, Platina John, to whom we believe one could have entrusted oneself entirely, made it a point precisely not to accept disciples, but rather to inspire and encourage independent labors within the Church, under the conditions of growth and mutual counsel within the Orthodox tradition." Unquote. On obedience to bishops, in the light of the teachings of St. Ignatius, Brianchaninov, and the Arena, and on the subjugation of the Moscow Patriarchate under the Soviets, the problem of Sergianism, Father Seraphim explained, quote, "Concerning the Arena, page 52, the moral hidden obedience performed in the soul seems to refer to our obedient orientation to God in general, which we should not think is satisfied if we are merely outwardly obedient to monastic or church authorities. It can happen that outward obedience is overemphasized, that it becomes a mechanical substitute for the genuine voluntary inward giving up of one's own will and understanding. The distinction can be felt in the heart. Sooner or later, an unsound mechanical obedience will produce a feeling of oppression, intenseness, which are signs that something is wrong. Genuine inward obedience is accompanied by the joy of being relieved of trusting only oneself. This subject is extremely deep and is closely bound up with the whole subject of genuine versus false orthodoxy in the 20th century, most acutely in Sergianism, where obedience indeed becomes slavery to men and the human church organization. True obedience is accompanied by inward freedom, without which there is no church life." Unquote. The subject of obedience to the hierarchy in the context of Sergianism was also highlighted in the Orthodox word in the context of the epistles of Hieromartyr Cyril Kazan, Elocum Tenens, to the patriarchal throne, appointed by Patriarch St. Tikhon of Moscow and all Russia. Metropolitan Cyril stated in his epistles that Metropolitan Sergius's declaration, which submitted the Church in Russia to the will of the atheist Soviet regime, was such that obedience to him automatically ceased on the part of all sincere Orthodox people, and Metropolitan Sergius could not trouble to send us his directives, since for them in our arch-pastoral conscience we cannot acknowledge any obligatory significance. Regarding St. Cyril's epistles, Father Seraphim published in the Orthodox Word his understanding that St. Cyril was opposing the belief that the Christian conscience is compelled to obey any command of the church authorities as long as these authorities are properly canonical. Father Seraphim elaborated, quote, "This blind concept of obedience for its own sake is one of the chief causes for the success of Sergianism in our century, both within and outside the Moscow Patriarchate. Of course, the Christian conscience does not accept excommunications of a church authority made under political or other non-ecclesiastical pressure, whether from the Turkish Sultan upon the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 19th century, or the communist authorities upon the Moscow Patriarchate of our own century. But it is a kind of ecclesiastical legalism to draw from this conclusion that all the mysteries of such a church authority are thereby without grace. The epistles of Metropolitan Cyril present, perhaps as clearly as it can be stated, the truth that the law and teaching of the Church of Christ can never be a matter of merely soulless obedience." Unquote. When those in Rocourt among the Mathewite contingent became increasingly critical of the Rocourt Synod for not officially breaking communion with other local Orthodox churches and declaring them to be without grace, Father Seraphim wrote to Father Nikitas that he was not advocating blind obedience to bishops, but that perhaps more trust in the Synod was warranted. Quote, Once again, we are not preaching to you blind obedience to bishops, but we are asking you to be a little less sure of yourself when you see that no less zealous Orthodox, including some of your own bishops, while in substantial agreement about the state of orthodoxy today, advocate a humbler path." Unquote. For Father Seraphim, obedience was of the utmost importance, lest a person fall into pride and delusion by trusting their own opinions and thinking that they alone know what is right. In his notes on convert pitfalls, his first point is trusting oneself most. Remedy: sober distrust of oneself, taking counsel of others wiser, guidance from the Holy Fathers. From Father Seraphim's correspondence, it is clear that he did not privately trust his own opinions, but regularly sought spiritual guidance and advice from monks, priests, and bishops, whom he respected for their wisdom and spiritual discernment. On the subject of the reception of particular converts, Father Seraphim often deferred in his letters to the decisions of the bishops of Roquefort, because he respected their authority. At the same time, he wrote about the dangers of blind obedience to church authorities, and saw that true obedience to hierarchs presupposes that the hierarchs are seeking above all to lead their flocks to salvation, and are not governing the church according to worldly goals and criteria. In the case of Metropolitan Sergius, who agreed to subjugate the church in Russia to the will of the atheist Soviet regime, Father Seraphim agreed with hero martyr Cyril Kazan that obedience to hierarchs merely for the sake of obedience can be destructive, that the presuppositions for true and God-pleasing obedience are absent. Father Seraphim warned also the Sergianist spirit that was becoming increasingly common among Orthodox bishops throughout the world, where hierarchs who are not striving to be absolutely obedient to Christ demand absolute obedience from their clergy, which is often a mere outward obedience and service of worldly objectives, whether political or ecumenist, rather than striving for obedience to the Holy Spirit and to the teachings and examples of the saints. Father Seraphim understood the God-inspired approach to true obedience from his time with St. John, from the lives and writings of the saints, and applied what he learned to the trials and temptations he faced, while struggling first as a simple monastic and then as a hero monk. After the Repose of Father Seraphim. In 1977, Father Seraphim was ordained to the priesthood, and consequently received all converts into the church by baptism. Up to the time of his repose 5 years later, August 20th, September 2nd, 1982, and only 48 years old. In 1986, as Father Seraphim foresaw, Father Panteleimon went into schism from Roquefort, together with the monasteries, clergy, and parishes that were under his influence. Father Panteleimon reposed in 2016, and the HOCNA, Holy Orthodox Church in North America, group that he established is still out of communion with the canonical Orthodox churches, as well as the other Old Calendars factions. In 1991 occurred the fall of the Soviet Union. In 2000, the Moscow Patriarchate glorified the new martyrs who were persecuted and killed by the Soviets, and in 2007, Roquefort reunited with the Moscow Patriarchate. The years leading up to the 2007 reunification were very difficult for Roquefort, and many who have been influenced by sectarian ecclesiology that Father Seraphim warned of split off from Roquefort into many factions. As Father Seraphim predicted to Alexei in a letter on June 2nd, 15th, 1976, the right wing of Orthodoxy will probably be divided into many small jurisdictions in the future, most of them anathematizing and fighting with the others. While these divisions were tragic, the 2007 restoration of communion with the Moscow Patriarchate helped to restore relations between Roquefort and the other canonical Orthodox churches. While those who had fallen into the sectarian mentality that so grieved Father Seraphim departed from Roquefort in the process, while Roquefort no longer has within it a Mathewite contingent, which sees other local Orthodox churches as without grace in their mysteries, the 1971 decree of Roquefort remains in place. Converts are received by baptism as a rule, and corrective baptisms continue to be performed in Roquefort. At the Uncut Mountain Press conference held October 6th through 9th, 2002, at the Antiochian Village in Pennsylvania, Rocor's Bishop Luke of Syracuse, the abbot of Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville, New York, stated, quote, "We've established to baptize all people coming into the church, except where it's necessary to use economia. We baptize many people in Jordanville from non-Orthodox backgrounds, and never, ever has a person come back and said, 'I should have been chrismated and not baptized.' It's totally ridiculous. However, it is very problematic when we have people coming and they want us to correct their baptism. And we do that too. And that's with the blessing of Metropolitan Laurus and Metropolitan Hilarion. We do corrective baptisms for the patristic reasons why you can do them. But it's preferable to do it right the first time." Unquote. Another major development occurred in Orthodoxy in America after Father Seraphim's repose, when Granda Ephraim, 2019, disciple of St. John the Hesychist, 1959, and a former abbot of Philotheo Monastery on Mount Athos, came to reside in America, where he established 17 monasteries between 1989 to 2004. As an Athonite elder and a spiritual inheritor of the patristic and hesychastic tradition of St. Paisius Belichovsky, St. Nicodemus the Hagarite, and all the Colevades father, Granda Ephraim also taught that all converts should be received into the Orthodox Church by baptism and 3 immersions in the name of the Holy Trinity, and all who are received into the Orthodox Church by a different method still must be baptized in the Orthodox Church. However, far from merely following Athonite practice and the rudder on the reception of converts, Granda Ephraim also received the gift from God to see in the Spirit whether or not a person had been baptized in the Orthodox Church, and whether their baptism was performed with 3 full immersions as the apostolic canons require. Taking heed of Father Seraphim's advice to seek out and follow the living links to Holy Orthodoxy, many who have been inspired by Father Seraphim's life and teachings have turned for spiritual guidance to Granda Ephraim and the spiritual fathers appointed by him, including at least one monastery established in the 1990s through the influence of Father Herman after the repose of Father Seraphim. The writings of Father Seraphim are also carried and sold at the bookstores of Granda Ephraim's monasteries, which are known for being very selective and careful about what books they make available, thereby expressing a certain oneness of mind with Father Seraphim and his legacy. That Father Seraphim was unaware of the many contemporary God-bearing elders on Mount Athos in Greece and elsewhere during his life is clear from his August 10, 23, 1976 letter to Archdeacon Lawrence, where he states, quote, "I must tell you first of all that, to the best of our knowledge, there are no strazzi today, that is, truly God-bearing elders in the spirit of the Platina elders, who could guide you, not by their own wisdom and understanding of the Holy Fathers, but by the enlightenment of the Holy Spirit." Unquote. Father Seraphim did not say absolutely that such true elders did not exist, but only to the best of our knowledge at that time. Certainly, had Father Seraphim been able to become acquainted with the many true contemporary saints and elders of his time, on Mount Athos in Greece and elsewhere, he would have taken great interest in their teachings on all matters, including on the reception of converts. Conclusion. The name of Father Seraphim Rose has often been called upon as supposedly being against the practice of receiving all converts by baptism and practicing corrective baptism for those who previously were received into the Orthodox Church by means other than baptism in the apostolic form. Father Seraphim's supposed views on these topics are typically illustrated using only 1 or 2 quotes from his personal letters, without understanding the context of his words, and while ignoring other letters of his which address the matter differently. It is clear from the vast corpus of Father Seraphim's writings that he did not produce any books, articles, or treatises on the topic of the reception of converts or corrective baptism, on the basis of the canons, the ecumenical councils, and the writings of the saints and fathers. While criticizing Daniel Olson in 1976 for the corrective baptism he received at Jordanville, a more thorough reading of the context of his letters shows that Father Seraphim was not necessarily concerned about corrective baptism per se, but rather with the attitudes being expressed by particular individuals about such events and the growing influence of Father Panteleimon's sectarian Mathewite Ecclesiology in ROCOR at that time. Father Seraphim's letters the same year to Andrew Bond express openness to the practice of corrective baptism under some conditions, though he did not elaborate on these conditions. With Father Seraphim's tremendous love for and veneration of St. Paisius Velichowski and St. Nicodemus the Hagarite, it is inconceivable to think that he would have considered them to be in error for insisting that all converts must enter the Orthodox Church through baptism, as he clearly agreed with them that there is no grace in the sacraments performed outside of the Orthodox Church. When discussing the reception of converts in corrective baptism, Father Seraphim seemed to be caught between two opinions: obedience to the bishops of ROCOR or obedience to Father Panteleimon, and he saw obedience to the bishops of ROCOR as closer to the royal path of the Fathers. From Father Seraphim's correspondence, it doesn't appear that he discussed these topics with any contemporary elders in Greece or elsewhere who were true spiritual successors of St. Nicodemus the Hagarite and St. Paisius Velichowski, and who upheld their teachings on the reception of converts. The main person Father Seraphim had contact with, who represented the Athonite and Colivades teachings, was Father Panteleimon, but his views on the topic were bound up with his Mathewite Old Calendarist Ecclesiology, which was not in line with the teachings of contemporary saints and elders on Mount Athos and in Greece who remained in communion with the Church of Greece, the ecumenical patriarch, and all local Orthodox churches. Regarding Father Seraphim's own reception into the Church by chrismation, Father Damascene wrote, quote, "During the decade following Eugene's entrance into the Church, a controversy arose in which improper receptions into orthodoxy were said to be invalid and without grace. Although Eugene was not baptized by an Orthodox priest after his Protestant baptism as an adolescent, but rather was canonically received into the Church through chrismation, he remained at peace in the midst of the controversy. His experience of grace upon entering the Church was too undeniably real to allow for any uncertainty." Unquote. It is truly puzzling that despite such a heated controversy over the reception of converts and corrective baptism in ROCOR during Father Seraphim's life, that nowhere in the over 300 personal letters that are publicly available, nor in any published articles in the Orthodox Word, does Father Seraphim justly or even mention his own reception. It is uncertain what Father Damascene bases the above comments on regarding Father Seraphim's reception in the light of the ensuing controversy, as he provides no quotes or references in support of this claim. According to the Old Calendarist, Archbishop Chrysostomos of Edna, 2019, who knew and corresponded with Father Seraphim, quote, "Father Seraphim rose, as I can demonstrate from personal correspondence, always regretted his reception into orthodoxy by chrismation, for which reason he unfailingly baptized converts from Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, and this was not a few in number." Unquote. As Father Damascene attested, Father Seraphim did baptize all converts, yet regarding any regrets that Father Seraphim had over his reception by chrismation, we have not been able to obtain any letters which confirm this, so we only have this testimony of Archbishop Chrysostomos. Some have wondered if this reception of converts into the Orthodox Church by baptism is necessary, as St. Nicodemus and St. Paisius Velichowski taught, and which the patristic consensus demonstrates. What does this mean for Father Seraphim, who never received baptism in the Orthodox Church? At least to our knowledge, regarding such a question, we need not speculate, but should rather follow the wise words of St. Cyprian of Carthage. Quote, "But as someone says, what then shall become of those who in past times, coming from heresy to the Church, were received without baptism? The Lord is able by His mercy to give indulgence, and not to separate from the gifts of His church those who by simplicity were admitted into the church, and in the church have fallen asleep. Nevertheless, it does not follow that, because there was some error at one time, there must always be error. Since it is more fitting for wise and God-fearing men, gladly and without delay, to obey the truth when laid open and perceived, than pertinaciously and obstinately to struggle against brethren and fellow priests on behalf of heretics." Unquote. It would be foolish to refrain from receiving all converts by baptism, only because Father Seraphim was not received into the church by baptism. When Father Seraphim himself baptized all converts, it would also be foolish to reject the teachings of the canons of the church, the ecumenical councils, and innumerable saints and fathers on the reception of converts, based on a couple statements Father Seraphim expressed in private letters. From Father Seraphim's writings and publications, it is clear that he did not seem to give much attention to what was the patristic teaching of the Church on the reception of converts. His personal correspondence shows that his overarching concern concerning this topic was not what was correct, but with the larger context of the influence of Father Panteleimon in his Mathewite Ecclesiology and mentality in Roquefort. While after his ordination to the priesthood in 1977, Father Seraphim received all converts into the Orthodox Church by baptism, there is no indication from what has been published that Father Seraphim performed any corrective baptisms himself, or refused to do so. Also, while Father Seraphim certainly respected the advice and decisions of certain Orthodox bishops in Roquefort, and upheld obedience to hierarchs as the ideal, he also understood that this rule has its limits, and that Orthodox Christians are not called to blind obedience to hierarchs. While there has been great interest in Father Seraphim's views on this topic, considering how important the issue was in his time, and the significant influence he has had on converts to Orthodoxy in and outside of America, we ultimately do not know much about his understanding and interpretation of the canons of the Church and his writings of the saints and fathers on the reception of converts, as he said surprisingly little concerning these things. Above all, what Father Seraphim has left us with is his own example as a priest who received all converts by baptism, and acted with great wisdom and discernment in the midst of major church controversies. It is inevitable that there will be disagreements in the church, and these disagreements can stir up the passions of pride and egotism, leading to divisions and schisms. In the midst of such controversies, we should humbly seek guidance from among those who are filled with the Holy Spirit, and who have the gifts of wisdom and discernment. We should not pridefully believe that we alone are right about any matter and denounce all who disagree, nor should we be quick to publicly denounce local Orthodox churches as without grace, prior to their condemnation by a pan-Orthodox council. Orthodox Christians must seek to know and defend the truth, and not give in to blind obedience. But the defense of the truth must be with humility and love, seeking guidance from the saints of our own times, while striving to preserve unity and peace in the Church. It is above all this humble approach to the defense of the truth that shines forth from the witness of Fear Monk Seraphim Rose. This concludes our reading of Father Seraphim Rose, Reception and Corrective Baptism. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe for more audiobooks.